The blood had soaked through his shirt so thoroughly that Helena Pratt could barely tell what color the fabric had been originally as she dragged the unconscious man through her doorway and onto the rough wooden floor of her small cabin. She had found him face down near the creek that ran through her property, his horse standing nearby with reins trailing in the dust, and though every instinct told her to ride into Verdi for the doctor, she knew he would bleed out long before she could make the journey and return. It was the summer of 1882 in Nevada, and the heat pressed down on everything like a heavy blanket even as the sun began its descent toward the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. Helena had been collecting water when she spotted him, and now as she knelt beside his prone form in her cabin, she wondered if she had just invited trouble or saved a life. Perhaps both. The man was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face that might have been handsome if it was not currently gray with blood loss. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear thrumming through her veins. Her mother had been a midwife and healer before consumption took her 3 years ago, and Helena had learned enough to treat most common ailments and injuries. But this was serious. The bullet wound in his side was still bleeding, and she needed to stop it before anything else. She fetched her sharpest knife, held it in the flame of her lamp until it glowed, then cut away his shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was fortunate. She would not have to dig for it. Helena cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey and boiled water, then packed it with clean cloth torn from one of her few spare sheets. The man groaned but did not wake, which was probably for the best. She bound his torso tightly, then covered him with a blanket and sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Only then did she really look at him. His hands were calloused, but his nails were clean. His boots were fine leather, well made and expensive. The gun belt she had removed from his waist was tooled with intricate designs, and the revolver itself was nickel-plated with pearl grips. This was no ordinary drifter. She went through his pockets looking for identification, feeling only slightly guilty about it. A man had a right to privacy, but she had a right to know who she was harboring in her home. She found a folded piece of paper, a few coins, and a leather wallet. Inside the wallet was more money than she had seen in months, maybe years. Helena swallowed hard and counted it twice to be sure. $300. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it aside and unfolded the paper. It was a deed to a property, signed and sealed, but the name meant nothing to her. Quinton Ashford. She looked at the unconscious man again, studying his face. The name suited him somehow. That first night she barely slept, checking his breathing and his bandages every hour. His fever climbed as the darkness deepened, and she spent most of the night sponging his face and chest with cool water, trying to bring his temperature down. He muttered in his delirium, fragments of sentences that made no sense. Something about cattle and someone named Robert and getting back before the investors arrived. Helena hushed him gently, the way her mother had hushed her when she was small and sick, and eventually he quieted. By morning his fever had broken, and he was sleeping more peacefully. Helena allowed herself to doze in the chair beside her bed where she had managed to drag him the night before. She woke to find the sun already high and the cabin stifling with heat. The man, Quinton, was still unconscious, but his color was better. She changed his bandages, relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped, and managed to get a little water between his lips. Her small ranch, if it could be called that, consisted of this cabin, a lean-to for her 2 horses, a chicken coop, and 20 acres of scrubland that she was trying desperately to keep from blowing away. Her father had claimed this land, built this cabin, and died of a heart attack 2 winters after her mother passed. leaving Helena alone at 21 with a piece of property and very little else. She took in mending when she could, sold eggs in town, and did whatever work she could find to keep herself fed and the land taxes paid. She could not afford to take time away from her chores to nurse a stranger, but she could not let him die either. So she worked twice as hard, rushing through her morning tasks so she could check on him, then rushing through her afternoon chores to check again. On the second day, he developed another fever and she feared infection, but by evening it had subsided. On the third day, his eyes fluttered open briefly, and he looked at her with confusion before slipping back into unconsciousness. On the fourth day, he woke properly. Helena was sitting beside the bed, mending one of her dresses by lamplight, when she heard him stir. She set down her sewing and leaned forward, her hand instinctively going to his forehead to check for fever. His hand shot up and caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been at death's door. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. "My home." "My name is Helena Pratt. I found you by the creek 4 days ago. You had been shot." His eyes, she noticed, were a deep brown, almost black in the lamplight. He released her wrist and tried to sit up, then groaned and fell back against the pillow, his hand going to his bandaged side. "Easy," she said. "You will tear your stitches." The bullet went through, but I had to close both wounds. You are lucky it missed anything vital." He closed his eyes, breathing carefully. "Water." She brought him a cup and helped him drink, supporting his head with her hand. He drained it and asked for more. When he had drunk his fill, he looked at her again with those dark eyes. "Thank you. I would be dead if you had not found me." "Probably," Helena agreed. There seemed little point in false modesty. "What happened?" "Ambush. 2 men. I was riding back from Reno and they came out of nowhere." He paused, his jaw tightening. "They got my horse." "Is he?" "Your horse is fine. He is in my lean-to with my horses, a handsome bay gelding." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you for everything." He hesitated. "I am Quinton Ashford." "I know. I found your papers. I hope you do not mind, but I needed to know who you were." "Of course." He tried to shift position and winced again. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. You lost a lot of blood. You will need to rest for at least 2 weeks before you can even think about riding." Something like alarm crossed his face. 2 weeks? "I cannot." He stopped, clearly thinking better of whatever he was about to say. "I have business. People will be looking for me." "Then they will find you here, recovering instead of dead in the scrubland," Helena said firmly. "You are in no condition to go anywhere." He studied her for a long moment, and she got the feeling he was not used to being told what to do, but eventually he nodded. "You are right, of course. I apologize. I am not the best patient. I imagine few men are." She stood and smoothed her skirt. "Are you hungry?" "I have soup." "Starving." She brought him broth, which was all she dared give his stomach after 4 days of nothing, and he ate it slowly while she told him how she had found him and what she had done to treat his wound. He listened carefully, asking a few questions, and she could see him evaluating her, trying to figure her out just as she was trying to figure him out. "You live here alone?" he asked when she took his empty bowl. "Yes." "That must be difficult." "I manage." She heard the defensiveness in her own voice and softened it. "I have been on my own for 2 years now. You learn to adapt." "I am sure you do." He was quiet for a moment. "I should pay you for your trouble, for the supplies you have used and your time." "That is not necessary." "It is absolutely necessary. You saved my life." He looked toward where she had placed his belongings on her small table. "My wallet is right there, untouched except for when I looked for identification. I am poor, Mr. Ashford, but I am not a thief. I never thought you were." His voice was gentle. "But you have taken care of me for 4 days. You deserve compensation." "We will discuss it when you are better," Helena said, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Right now, you need to rest." He looked like he wanted to argue, but exhaustion was clearly overtaking him. His eyelids drooped despite his obvious efforts to keep them open. "Thank you, Miss Pratt," he murmured, and then he was asleep again. Helena sat in her chair and picked up her mending, but she found herself watching him instead of working. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond his expensive belongings and mysterious circumstances. Something in the way he looked at her, with respect and genuine gratitude, rather than the assessment she usually got from men sizing up a woman alone. She shook her head at her own foolishness and focused on her sewing. He was a stranger who would be gone as soon as he was well enough to ride. There was no point in any thoughts beyond that. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Helena would wake at dawn, check on Quinton, then tend to her animals and her small garden. She would return to give him breakfast, usually more broth or thin porridge, change his bandages, and make sure he was comfortable. Then she would work on whatever tasks needed doing until midday, when she would return to give him lunch and check his wound again. Afternoons were for mending or preserving what vegetables she could coax from her struggling garden, with frequent stops to look in on her patient. Evenings she would make dinner, usually sharing it with him now that he was awake and alert, and then she would settle into her chair with her sewing while he rested. They talked during those evening hours. At first the conversations were simple, superficial things. The weather, which was brutally hot even by Nevada standards this year. Her chickens, which were not laying as well as she hoped. His horse, who she had learned was named Ranger and who had the finest tack she had ever seen. But gradually, as Quinton grew stronger and more alert, their conversations deepened. She learned that he was 26, just 3 years older than herself. That he had grown up in San Francisco, the son of a banker who had made a fortune in the silver boom. That he had come to Nevada 5 years ago with a dream of raising cattle and building something with his own hands rather than living off his father's legacy. "My father thought I was insane," Quinton said one evening, carefully shifting position in the bed. He could sit up now without too much pain, though standing was still difficult. "Leaving behind a comfortable life to break my back on a ranch. He said I would be back within a year, begging for my old position at the bank." "But you were not," Helena said, threading her needle by lamplight. "No. I bought land south of here, near the California border. Started with 100 head of cattle and a lot of optimism." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "Now I have 3,000 head and 4 working ranches spread across 2 states. Helena's hand stilled on her sewing. 3,000 head, give or take a few hundred. He said it casually as if it was nothing remarkable. "I have been fortunate. The beef market is strong and I have good men working for me." She resumed her sewing, processing this information. 3,000 head of cattle, 4 ranches. The money in his wallet suddenly made more sense, as did the quality of his belongings. This was not just a successful rancher. This was someone with real wealth. "Your men must be worried about you," she said carefully. "They are probably tearing up half of Nevada looking for me by now," Quinton admitted. "My foreman, Robert Coulter, was expecting me back a week ago. I had been in Reno meeting with some investors about expanding operations." He rubbed his jaw, where several days' worth of beard had grown in. "I should try to get word to him. Verdi is only 6 miles from here. I could ride in tomorrow and send a telegram if you tell me where." "Would you?" Relief flooded his face. "I would be grateful. I will write out the message tonight." "You should rest your strength," Helena said, but she was already planning the trip in her mind. She needed to go to town anyway to trade eggs for flour. "I have been resting for over a week. I am starting to go mad from inactivity." He watched her so for a moment. "May I ask you something?" Of course. How did you end up here alone? You said your parents passed, but surely you have other family, friends. Helena kept her eyes on her stitching. My parents came west from Missouri when I was 12. They were looking for a fresh start, and my father had always dreamed of having his own land. We settled here, and for a while things were good. Then my mother got sick. Consumption. She died slowly over the course of a year. My father never really recovered from losing her. He kept working the land, but his heart was not in it. 2 years later, he had a heart attack and died in the field. I am sorry. Quinton's voice was soft. It was 2 years ago. She tied off her thread and snipped it. I had a few distant cousins back in Missouri who wrote after my father died, suggesting I sell the land and come live with them. But this is my home. My parents are buried here. I was not ready to give it up. So you stayed. Alone. So I stayed. She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes. People in town think I am foolish. A woman alone trying to work a ranch. They are probably right, but I could not leave. I do not think you are foolish, Quinton said quietly. I think you are brave. Something warm unfurled in Helena's chest at his words, but she pushed it down. I am not brave. I am stubborn. There is a difference. Is there? He smiled slightly. I am not sure I see it. She changed the subject, asking him about his ranches, and he obliged, describing the operations and the challenges of managing so much land and so many cattle. Helena found herself fascinated despite herself. She had been struggling just to keep 20 acres from turning to dust, and here was a man managing thousands of acres across multiple properties. The next morning she rose early, gathered her eggs, and prepared for the ride to Verdi. Quinton had written out his telegram the night before in a surprisingly neat hand, and she tucked it carefully into her pocket along with the money he had insisted she take to pay for it. Are you sure you will be all right while I am gone? She asked before leaving. He was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had since she found him, but still pale. I will be fine. I am planning to do nothing more strenuous than sleeping and possibly eating the bread you left me. Do not try to get up and walk around. You are not ready for that yet. Yes, madam. There was a hint of amusement in his voice that made her want to smile despite herself. The ride to Verdi took just over an hour at an easy pace. The town was small, barely more than a cluster of buildings along the railroad tracks, but it had a telegraph office, a general store, a saloon, and a church. Helena stopped first at the general store to trade her eggs for flour and a few other supplies, then headed to the telegraph office. The operator, a thin man named Samuel who had a tendency to gossip, read the telegram with undisguised interest. Quinton Ashford, that name sounds familiar. I would not know, Helena said blandly. A friend asked me to send it as a favor. H.M. Samuel counted out the words and told her the price. As she paid, he said casually, You know, there was a group of men through here about 3 days ago asking if anyone had seen a man matching a certain description. Said he was missing and they were worried about him. Helena kept her face neutral. Is that so? Yep. They were from one of the big ranches south of here. The Circle A, I think. That is Quinton Ashford's brand. Samuel leaned forward conspiratorially. They say he is the richest rancher in the valley, maybe the richest in all of Nevada. Built his whole operation from nothing in just 5 years. How interesting, Helena said, taking her change. Thank you for sending the telegram. She left before Samuel could ask any more questions, but her mind was whirling. The richest rancher in the valley. She had known Quinton was successful, but this was something else entirely. And she had him in her cabin, sleeping in her bed, eating her food. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. When she returned home, she found Quinton exactly where she had left him, though he was awake and looking restless. His face brightened when she entered. How did it go? The telegram is sent. Your foreman should receive it today." She began unpacking her supplies. The telegraph operator seemed very interested in the name Quinton Ashford. "He mentioned that your men had been through town looking for you." Quinton grimaced. "I was afraid of that. Robert has probably been imagining the worst. He also mentioned that you own the Circle a ranch and that you are, and I quote, the richest rancher in the valley." Helena turned to face him, crossing her arms. "You might have mentioned that part." "Would it have changed anything?" Quinton asked quietly. Helena considered this. "No," she admitted, "but it was still a rather significant detail to leave out." "I know. I am sorry." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as one he made when he was uncomfortable. "The truth is, most people treat me differently when they know who I am and what I have. You have been treating me like a person, not like a business opportunity or a source of money. It has been refreshing." "I have been treating you like a patient who was bleeding all over my floor," Helena said, but there was no real heat in her words. She understood what he meant. She had seen the way people in town looked at her sometimes, with pity or judgment or speculation. It would be worse, she imagined, to be looked at and see only dollar signs. Even so, Quinton smiled. "Thank you for sending the telegram. With any luck, Robert will have men out here tomorrow to collect me." Something sank in Helena's chest at those words, though she could not have said exactly what. Of course, he would leave as soon as his men arrived. That had always been the plan. She had been nursing him back to health so that he could return to his life, which was clearly a very full and successful life that had nothing to do with her. "You should not ride for at least another week," she said firmly. "Your wound is healing well, but you could still tear something if you are not careful." "I will take a wagon," Quinton assured her. "I promise I will not do anything to undo all your hard work." That evening their conversation was more stilted than usual. Helena could not stop thinking about the fact that he would be leaving soon, and she thought perhaps Quinton was thinking about it too. They talked about inconsequential things, avoiding anything too personal, and Helena excused herself early to sleep in her chair rather than continue the awkward dance of things unsaid. The next morning brought visitors. Helena heard the horses before she saw them, and when she looked out her window, she saw 4 men riding up to her cabin. They were dressed like working ranch hands, but their horses were quality animals and their gear was well maintained. The man in front, older than the others with steel gray hair and a weathered face, dismounted and approached her door. Helena stepped outside before he could knock, not wanting to disturb Quinton if he was still sleeping. "Can I help you?" The gray-haired man removed his hat. "Begging your pardon, madam. My name is Robert Coulter. I am looking for my employer, Quinton Ashford. We received a telegram that said he was here recovering from an injury. He is inside. He was shot, but he is healing." Helena stepped aside. "You can see him, but please be quiet. He needs his rest." Robert nodded and gestured for the other men to wait. He followed Helena inside, and she saw his face transform from worry to relief when he spotted Quinton sitting up in bed. "Boss." Robert's voice was rough with emotion. "We thought you were dead." "Not quite," Quinton said with a slight smile. "Though I came close. Miss Pratt saved my life." Robert turned to Helena with an expression of such profound gratitude that she felt uncomfortable. "Madam, I do not know how to thank you. Quinton is like a son to me." If anything had happened to him, he stopped, overcome. "I did what anyone would do," Helena said quietly. "No," Quinton said from the bed. "You did far more than that. Robert, Miss Pratt has been taking care of me for over a week. She found me by her creek, carried me into her home, treated my wound, and nursed me through fever and delirium. I owe her my life. Then the Circle owes you a debt we can never fully repay," Robert said seriously, "but we will certainly try." "Please, let me compensate you for your time and trouble." "That is not necessary," Helena began. "It absolutely is," Quinton interrupted, "and I will not hear any arguments about it. Robert, please ensure that Miss Pratt receives appropriate compensation for everything she has done." Robert nodded. "Of course. Whatever you think is appropriate, boss." They discussed logistics then, and it was decided that Quinton would remain in Helena's care for a few more days while a proper wagon was prepared to transport him back to the Circle A. Robert left one of the men, a young cowboy named James, to help Helena with any heavy work around the property and to serve as a messenger if needed. Then he and the other men rode off, promising to return in 3 days with the wagon. "You really did not need to leave one of your men here," Helena said after they had gone. "I can manage my own work." "Consider it a favor to me," Quinton said. "I will rest easier knowing you have help with the heavy lifting. James is a good worker. He will not be in your way." James proved to be a cheerful young man of about 20, who was more than happy to repair the sagging fence in Helena's chicken yard and chop enough wood to last her for weeks. He slept in the lean-to with the horses and took his meals with Helena and Quinton, providing a buffer for some of the strange intimacy that had been building between them. On the second evening, after James had excused himself for the night, Helena was washing the dinner dishes when Quinton spoke from the bed. He was able to stand now and take a few careful steps, though he tired easily. "I have been thinking about your situation here," he said. Helena turned from the dishpan. "My situation, this property. 20 acres of land that is barely arable, no close neighbors, and you are working it alone. It is not sustainable, Helena." Something in her chest tightened at the way he said her name. He had been calling her Miss Pratt since he woke, and the sudden informality felt significant. "I have managed for 2 years," she said. "You have survived for 2 years. That is not the same thing." Quinton shifted position carefully. "What you need is water, a proper well and irrigation system. Some of the eastern part of your property is good grazing land if it had sufficient water. You could run a few cattle, maybe some sheep. All of which requires money I do not have. But I do." Quinton met her eyes steadily. "Let me invest in your property. I can provide the capital for a well and irrigation system. In exchange, I will take a percentage of the profits from any livestock you raise for the first 5 years. After that, the improvements are yours free and clear, and so are all the profits." Helena stared at him. "That is absurd." "Why would you do that?" "Because I owe you my life. Because I have more money than I know what to do with. Because you deserve a chance to make this land work the way you have always dreamed it could." He paused. "And because I would like to help you if you will let me. I do not need charity." "It is not charity. It is a business proposition. You will work the land, manage the livestock, and do all the actual labor. I am simply providing capital in exchange for a return on investment. It is what I do." He smiled slightly. "I am actually quite good at it." Helena turned back to her dishes, her mind racing. What he was offering could change everything. A proper well would transform her property. She could have a real garden, maybe even a small orchard. She could run cattle or sheep and actually make a living instead of just scraping by. But the thought of being indebted to him, of being tied to him through business, made her uncomfortable in ways she could not quite articulate. "I will think about it," she said finally. "That is all I ask." On Quinton's last night in her cabin, Helena found herself unable to sleep. She sat in her chair, supposedly mending but really just thinking, while Quinton dozed fitfully in the bed. The lamp burned low between them, casting long shadows across the rough walls. "You are awake," Quinton said softly, and she realized he had been watching her. "I could say the same for you." I have been sleeping for days. I am tired of sleeping." He was quiet for a moment. "Robert will be here tomorrow morning to take me home, I know." "I do not want to go." The words hung in the air between them. Helena set down her sewing and looked at him. "You have to. You have a ranch to run, employees who depend on you, business to conduct. I know that. But I still do not want to go." Quinton sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "These past 10 days being here with you have been the most peaceful I have felt in years. Despite being shot and nearly dying." "You are delirious," Helena said lightly, but her heart was pounding. "I am not." He stood carefully and crossed the small distance to her chair, then knelt in front of her, wincing slightly at the pull on his healing wound. "Helena, I know this is sudden. I know we have only known each other for 10 days, but I cannot leave without saying this. I have feelings for you, real feelings, and I think, perhaps, you might feel the same way." Helena's breath caught. "Quinton, you do not have to say anything now. But I want you to know that I would like to court you properly if you will allow it. I will come visit. We can spend time together, get to know each other better. And if, after a few months, you find that you care for me the way I care for you." He reached up and took her hand. "I would very much like to see where this leads." She should say no. She should tell him that the idea was ridiculous, that they came from completely different worlds, that he was the richest rancher in the valley, and she was barely hanging onto her 20 acres by her fingernails. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw none of the things that usually made her feel lesser. She saw only honest affection and hope. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, you may court me." The smile that broke across Quinton's face was worth every moment of uncertainty. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, and Helena felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a landscape she had never imagined for herself. Robert arrived the next morning with a comfortable wagon fitted with a padded bench seat and driven by James. Quinton's belongings were gathered. His horse Ranger was tacked and tied to the back of the wagon, and everything was ready for departure. But Quinton lingered in the doorway of Helena's cabin, his eyes moving over the small space as if committing it to memory. "Thank you," he said again. "For everything." "You are welcome," Helena replied, suddenly shy. "Please take care of yourself. Change the bandages daily and watch for any signs of infection. I have 3 ranch hands who used to be Army medics. Robert will make sure I follow your instructions to the letter." Quinton smiled. "I will be back in 3 days to discuss the business proposition, if that gives you enough time to think it over." 3 days is fine." He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. 3 days, he repeated. And then he was walking carefully to the wagon, Robert supporting him on one side. Helena watched them drive away, Quinton turning to look back at her until the wagon rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. She stood in her doorway for a long time after, her hand still warm from his touch, wondering what she had just agreed to. The cabin felt too quiet without him. She threw herself into work, cleaning every surface even though everything was already clean, washing all the linens, scrubbing the floors. She was gathering eggs the next afternoon when she saw a rider approaching. For one wild moment she thought it might be Quinton, but as the figure drew closer she recognized Robert Coulter. He dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands. "Miss Pratt, I apologize for disturbing you. I wanted to check on you, make sure you had everything you needed." "I am fine, thank you. How is Quinton?" "Resting and complaining about being treated like an invalid." Robert smiled. "He is in good spirits, though, better than I have seen him in months, if I am being honest. I think his time here was good for him in more ways than one." Helena felt her cheeks warm. "I was glad to help. There is something else." Robert shifted his weight. "Quinton wanted me to bring you this as compensation for your care." He held out an envelope. Helena took it automatically, then gasped when she felt the weight of it. She opened the envelope and stared at the bills inside. There had to be several $100s there. "I cannot accept this," she said immediately, trying to hand it back. "It is too much." "It is not nearly enough," Robert said firmly. "You saved his life, Miss Pratt. How do you put a price on that? Quinton wanted to give you more, but I convinced him you might find a larger amount insulting." He smiled. "He argued with me for an hour about it. Please take it. Use it to improve your property or save it or do whatever you wish. But do not refuse it. It would hurt him if you did." Helena looked down at the money, emotions warring inside her. Pride told her to refuse it, to insist that she had not saved Quinton's life for money. But practicality whispered that this money could solve so many problems, could buy her security for months to come. "All right," she said quietly. "Please tell him thank you." "I will." Robert paused. "I should also tell you that Quinton has been talking about you constantly since we brought him home. I have known that boy since he was 21 years old and fresh off the train from San Francisco. I have never seen him like this about anyone." "We hardly know each other," Helena protested. "Sometimes that is all it takes. My wife and I knew each other for 2 weeks before I proposed. We have been married 32 years now." Robert settled his hat back on his head. "I am just saying, Miss Pratt, that if Quinton comes courting, as I suspect he will, I hope you will give him a fair chance. He is a good man, one of the best I have ever known." "I will," Helena promised. Robert tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Helena alone with an envelope full of money and a head full of confused thoughts. She went inside and counted the money carefully. $400. More money than she had seen in her entire life. Enough to pay her land taxes for 2 years and have plenty left over for supplies and improvements. She sat at her table with the bills spread out in front of her and felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she was not terrified of losing her home. Quinton arrived exactly 3 days later, driving a small buggy himself despite Helena's concerns about his wound. He looked much better, his color fully returned and his movements easier, though he still moved carefully when he climbed down from the buggy. "The doctor cleared me for light activity," he said when he saw her expression, "and he agreed that driving a buggy qualifies as light. If you tear your stitches, I am not fixing them again," Helena said, but she was smiling. "Noted." Quinton smiled back, and the warmth in his eyes made her pulse quicken. "Have you thought about my proposition?" "I have, and I have some conditions." "I am listening." They walked through her property as she laid out her thoughts. She would accept his investment, but she wanted a proper contract drawn up specifying exactly what he was providing and what his share of the profits would be. She wanted to maintain full control of the property and all decisions regarding its management. And she wanted the option to buy out his share early if she was able to raise the capital. Quinton listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or suggesting modifications, and by the time they returned to her cabin, they had the framework of an agreement. He wrote it all down in his neat hand while she made coffee, and they reviewed it together until they were both satisfied. "I will have my lawyer draw up the formal contract and bring it out next week," Quinton said. "In the meantime, I will send some men out tomorrow to start surveying for the well." "So quickly? No point in waiting. We are already past the middle of summer. If we can get the well dug and some basic irrigation in place before winter, you can start preparing the soil this fall for planting in the spring." He set down his pen and looked at her. "This is going to work, Helena. I can feel it. 2 years from now, this property is going to be thriving." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Helena found herself actually believing it might be true. They talked for hours about her plans for the land, what crops might do well, What kind of livestock would be most profitable? Quinton had a wealth of knowledge from his years of ranching, and he shared it freely, making suggestions but always deferring to her judgment since it was her land. The sun was setting when he finally stood to leave. They walked out to his buggy together, and he paused before climbing up, turning to face her. "I have had a wonderful afternoon," he said. "Would you allow me to call on you again, not for business but for pleasure?" "I would like that," Helena said softly. "Tomorrow," she laughed. "Are you always this persistent?" "Only when something is important to me." He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You are important to me, Helena." She leaned into his touch without thinking and saw his eyes darken with emotion. "Tomorrow is fine," she whispered. He came the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Helena found herself watching the road in the late afternoons, listening for the sound of his buggy. He always brought something, a bag of sugar or fresh fruit from his orchards, or once, memorably, a kitten that had been born in his barn, and that he thought might help with her mouse problem. The kitten, a tiny orange tabby she named Sunset, became a fixture in her cabin, and Quinton's visits became the highlight of her days. They would walk her property together, watching as his crew worked on the well, or sit on her small porch in the evening and talk until the stars came out. He told her about growing up in San Francisco, about his decision to strike out on his own, about the challenges and triumphs of building his ranching empire. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the journey west, about her parents and her dreams for her land. It was after one of these evening conversations, about 2 weeks after his men had started work on the well, that Quinton took her hand and said, "I want to kiss you. May I?" Helena's heart stuttered. They had been moving toward this, she knew. The touches that lingered a bit too long, the way his eyes followed her, the way she caught herself looking at his mouth when he spoke. But the direct request still caught her off guard. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out breathier than she intended. He leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to change her mind, and brushed his lips against hers in the softest, sweetest kiss she had ever imagined. It was over almost before it began, but when he pulled back, his eyes were warm and his smile was tender. "I have been wanting to do that for days," he admitted. "Only days." Helena surprised herself with her boldness. "Weeks," he corrected. "Since the first time you scolded me for trying to sit up too quickly." He kissed her again, less tentatively this time, and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart racing under her palm, as fast as her own. They were more careful after that, both aware that they were walking a line between courtship and impropriety. Quinton always left before full dark, and they were never quite as physically close as they had been that first night of kissing. But the awareness was always there, humming between them like a plucked string. The well was finished in early August, and the transformation of Helena's property began in earnest. With reliable water, her garden flourished. The irrigation ditches Quinton's men dug brought life to land that had been brown and struggling, and green shoots began to appear where there had been only dust. Quinton helped her select 6 heifers and a bull, young stock that would form the foundation of her herd, and arranged for them to be delivered from one of his ranches. "You are giving me too much," Helena protested when the cattle arrived. "This was not part of our agreement." "Consider it a gift," Quinton said. "A woman I care about very much has a birthday coming up, and I wanted to give her something meaningful." Helena blinked. "How did you know when my birthday is?" I asked in town. He looked pleased with himself. "September 3rd. Which means we have 3 weeks to plan a proper celebration." "I do not need a celebration. Perhaps not, but I would like to give you one anyway." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I would like to do a lot of things for you if you will let me." Her birthday fell on a Sunday that year, and Quinton arrived in the morning with his buggy laden with supplies for a picnic. They drove to a spot he knew, a meadow high in the hills where a spring fed a small pool and wildflowers grew in profusion. It was beautiful and private, and they spent the afternoon eating the feast he had brought and talking and kissing in the dappled shade of an ancient oak tree. "I have something for you," Quinton said as the sun began its descent. He pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket and handed it to her. Helena unwrapped it carefully to find a velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. She opened it and found a tiny photograph of Quinton on one side, the kind taken in a studio. The other side was empty. "That side is for you," he said softly, "or for your family, or for whoever you want to carry close to your heart, but I wanted you to have something of me to keep." "It is beautiful," Helena whispered, touching the locket gently. "Help me put it on." He fastened it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin, and when she turned to thank him, she found him watching her with an expression so full of love that it took her breath away. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it is soon. I know we have only known each other for a few months. But I cannot keep it in any longer. I love you, Helena Pratt." Joy burst through her like sunrise. "I love you too," she said, and then they were kissing again, deeper and more passionate than before, and Helena felt like she might float away with happiness. They began discussing marriage after that, tentatively at first and then with growing certainty. Quinton wanted to marry her immediately, but Helena insisted they wait until spring. She wanted to prove to herself that she could make her ranch work, that she was not just accepting his proposal out of gratitude or economic necessity. And she wanted time to adjust to the idea of becoming the wife of the richest rancher in the valley, a position that terrified her more than a little. Quinton was patient, though she could tell the waiting was hard for him. He continued his regular visits, and Helena became a familiar sight at the circle as well, dining with him and meeting his employees and learning about the vast operations he managed. Robert Coulter became a friend, as did several of the other men who worked for Quinton. They treated her with respect and welcome, and gradually, Helena began to feel less like an outsider and more like someone who belonged. Winter came, and with it a slowdown in the ranch work. Helena's cattle were thriving, her land was transformed, and she had money saved from selling her surplus vegetables and eggs. When Quinton asked her in December if she would reconsider waiting until spring, she surprised them both by agreeing. They were married on a cold January day in 1883, in the small church in Verde with Robert Coulter as Quinton's best man and James's wife Sarah, who had become Helena's friend, as her attendant. It was a simple ceremony, but Helena felt like a princess in the blue dress Quinton had insisted on buying her, and when he kissed her after they were pronounced husband and wife, she felt the rightness of it in her bones. The wedding celebration that followed at the circle, a ranch, was anything but simple. Quinton had invited what seemed like half of Nevada, and the ranch house was packed with well-wishers and friends. Helena was overwhelmed at first by all the attention, but Quinton stayed close to her side, his hand warm in hers, and gradually she relaxed and began to enjoy herself. "Happy," he murmured in her ear during a brief moment alone. "Deliriously," she assured him, and kissed him in front of everyone, not caring who saw. They spent their wedding night in the master bedroom of the Circle, a ranch house, which was to be their home now. Helena had been nervous about this part, but Quinton was patient and tender, and what she had feared might be awkward or frightening turned out to be natural and beautiful. She fell asleep in his arms feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. The next months were a period of adjustment. Helena moved into the ranch house, but insisted on still managing her own property, riding over several times a week to check on her cattle and her land. Quinton supported this completely, even providing her with a gentle mare for the journey and occasionally riding over with her to help with whatever work needed doing. She also began to take on a role in managing the circle itself, starting small with the household accounts and gradually expanding to other areas as Quinton taught her about the business. She had a good head for figures and a practical approach to problem-solving that he valued, and within a few months, they were functioning as true partners in the operation. Their life together was not without challenges. Helena occasionally felt out of place among the wealthy ranchers and businessmen Quinton dealt with, and there were women in the area who made it clear they thought she had married above her station. But Quinton never wavered in his support, and gradually Helena developed her own confidence in her new role. In the spring, Helena discovered she was pregnant. Quinton was overjoyed, immediately becoming protective and fussy in a way that would have been irritating if it was not so endearing. He wanted her to stop riding over to her property, stop helping with the ranch work, stop doing anything more strenuous than sitting in a chair. Helena ignored most of these edicts, but she did agree to be more careful. Their son was born in December of 1883, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. They named him Thomas, after Helena's father, and Quinton held him with such tenderness, and wondered that Helena fell in love with her husband all over again. "Look what we made," Quinton whispered, gazing down at the sleeping infant in his arms. "He is perfect." "He is," Helena agreed, exhausted but happy, "just like his father." Thomas grew quickly, a bright and curious child who loved following his father around the ranch and helping his mother in her garden. When he was 2, Helena became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Claire. 2 years after that came another son, Daniel, and their family felt complete. Life at the circle settled into a comfortable rhythm. Helena managed both her original property, which she had never sold despite Quinton's offers to buy it from her, and took an increasing role in the circle operations. She discovered she had a talent for negotiation, and Quinton began bringing her along to business meetings, valuing her input and perspective. The years passed peacefully. Thomas grew into a responsible young man who wanted nothing more than to follow in his father's footsteps and run the ranch. Claire was bright and headstrong, interested in everything and determined to attend university back east, despite the novelty of such a thing for a woman. Daniel was the dreamer of the family, always drawing or reading or making up elaborate stories. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinton took Helena back to the meadow where he had given her the locket. It looked much the same as it had that day, wildflowers blooming and the spring bubbling peacefully. "You remember the day I brought you here?" he asked, holding her hand as they stood beneath the oak tree. "Of course. It was my 24th birthday. You told me you loved me for the first time. And you loved me back." He smiled at the memory. "I was so nervous, I thought you might think I was rushing things." "You were rushing things," Helena said with a laugh. "But I did not care. I already knew I wanted to spend my life with you. Even though I was a stranger you found bleeding by your creek, especially because of that." She turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his face. There was gray in his hair now and lines around his eyes, but he was still the most handsome man she knew. "That day changed everything. If I had not found you, if I had decided you were too much trouble to help, if any of 100 things had been different." "But they were not," Quinton said firmly. "You did find me. You did help me. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." He pulled her close. "I love you, Helena, more now than even that day in the meadow, which I would not have thought possible. I love you too, she whispered against his chest. Always. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the dappled shade while the spring bubbled and the wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Helena thought about the terrified young woman she had been, alone on a struggling ranch and barely holding on. She thought about the stranger she had found by the creek, and the leap of faith she had taken in helping him. And she thought about all the years since, filled with love and laughter and the family they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" Quinton asked softly. "About how lucky I am," Helena said. "About how one decision, one moment of compassion, changed my entire life." "You changed mine too," Quinton said. "You saved my life in more ways than one. Before you, I was successful but not happy. I had everything money could buy and nothing that really mattered. You gave me love, family, partnership, and purpose. You made me whole." Helena looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "We made each other whole." "Yes," he agreed and kissed her as the sun set over the valley they called home. More years passed, bringing changes and challenges but also joys. Thomas took over more of the daily operations of the Circle A, proving himself a worthy successor to his father. Claire went to university as she had dreamed, studying medicine, and eventually returning to Nevada to become one of the first female doctors in the state. Daniel became a teacher, using his gift for storytelling to inspire children throughout the valley. Helena and Quinton grew older together, their hair turning gray and their steps slowing, but their love never dimming. They spent their later years traveling, visiting the places they had always dreamed of seeing, but they always returned to the Circle A, to the valley that had brought them together. On a warm spring evening in 1915, Helena sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Quinton sat beside her, their hands clasped together as they had been for more than 30 years. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "You ever think about that day by the creek?" Helena asked. "The day I found you." "Every day," Quinton said. "That was the day my real life began. Mine too." Helena leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best," Quinton agreed. "And it all started because you had a kind heart and were brave enough to help a stranger. And because that stranger turned out to be the richest cowboy in the valley," Helena added with a smile. "And because we fell in love," Quinton corrected. "The rest was just details." Helena laughed softly. "Important details. Perhaps, but not as important as this." He raised their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. "Not as important as you and me and the life we built together." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. Around them, the Circle A ranch hummed with life, the legacy they would leave to their children and grandchildren. But in that moment, all that mattered was the warmth of Quinton's hand in hers, and the love that had sustained them through more than 3 decades of life together. Helena thought back to that young woman she had been, dragging a bleeding stranger into her cabin and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She had never imagined that the decision to help him would lead to this. A life full of love, a family that stretched across generations, a partnership that had enriched them both in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the heart. "Thank you," she whispered to Quinton as the first stars appeared. "For what? For falling off your horse near my creek, for letting me save you, for loving me." Quinton laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Thank you for saving me, for loving me back, and for making every day of the last 33 years an adventure I never wanted to end." They sat together long into the evening, talking and laughing and remembering. while their grandchildren played, and the ranch settled into the quiet of night around them. And when they finally went inside, hand in hand as they always were, Helena looked back at the star-filled sky and silently thanked whatever fate had brought Quinton to her door all those years ago. The years continued to pass gently. Helena and Quinton remained active in the ranch operations well into their 70s, though they increasingly left the day-to-day management to Thomas and his children. They took joy in their growing family, as grandchildren became adults and had children of their own, and the circle rang with the laughter of multiple generations. Helena's original 20 acres had been folded into the larger ranch operation, but she maintained a small garden there still, tending it herself when weather and health permitted. It was her place of peace, where she went to remember her parents and the young woman she had been before Quinton changed everything. One afternoon in the spring of 1920, as Helena knelt in that garden pulling weeds, Quinton found her there. He was 78 now and walked with a cane, but his eyes still lit up when he saw her the way they had on that first day he woke in her cabin. "Robert is coming for dinner tonight," he said, settling himself carefully on the bench Helena kept by the garden. "He wanted to remind us that it is the 38th anniversary of his first visit to this property, looking for his wayward employer." Helena laughed. "Robert would remember something like that. How is he?" Complaining about his rheumatism and boasting about his great-grandchildren. "So much as he has always been," Quinton smiled. "He says he is going to keep working until he is 90, just to spite everyone who said he was too old to be a foreman. Knowing Robert, he probably will." Helena stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I should go start dinner preparations." "Or you could sit here with your husband for a few minutes and watch the sunset," Quinton suggested. "The grandchildren are handling dinner tonight. They insisted." Helena settled beside him on the bench, and Quinton put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light change across the land that had brought them together so many years ago. "I have been thinking," Quinton said eventually, "about everything that had to happen for us to end up here. If I had taken a different road from Reno that day, if those men had not ambushed me, if they had been better shots, if you had been in town instead of by the creek, if you had decided to ride for the doctor instead of treating me yourself. So many things that could have gone differently." "But did not," Helena said softly. "But did not," he agreed. "And I am grateful for every single coincidence, every choice, every moment that led me to you." Helena turned to look at him, this man who had been the center of her life for nearly 40 years. His face was lined now, his hair white, his movements slower than they once were. But when she looked at him, she still saw the young man she had nursed back to health, the suitor who had courted her with such determination, the husband who had loved her through all the joys and sorrows life had brought. "I am grateful too," she said, "for all of it. For every moment we have shared." They sat together until the sun set, and the dinner bell rang from the main house, calling them home. Quinton stood and offered Helena his hand, and she took it, as she had taken it countless times over the decades. Together they walked slowly back to the ranch house, where their family waited. That evening, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with Robert regaling the younger generation with stories of the early days of the Circle A, Helena caught Quinton's eye across the crowded table. He smiled at her, that special smile that was hers alone, and she smiled back, her heart full. The meal stretched late into the evening with much laughter and storytelling. Young William, Thomas's grandson, who was just turning 18 and eager to learn the ranching business, asked Robert what Quinton had been like when he first came to Nevada. "Green as grass and twice as stubborn," Robert said with a laugh. Thought he knew everything about ranching because he had read some books. I had to teach him which end of a cow was which. That is not entirely accurate, Quinton protested mildly. It is mostly accurate, Robert countered. But he learned fast, I will give him that, and he had vision. He saw what this valley could become before anyone else did. By the time he was 30, he owned more land than anyone in the county. Because you helped me acquire it, Quinton pointed out, and because I had good advisors. He looked at Helena. And because I married the smartest woman in Nevada. Here, here, said Thomas, raising his glass. The toast was echoed around the table, and Helena felt her cheeks warm with pleasure and embarrassment. She had never quite gotten used to being the center of attention, even after all these years. As the evening wound down and family members began to drift away to their various homes on the ranch property, Helena and Quinton found themselves alone on the porch once more, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "You remember the first night you kissed me?" Helena asked. "Right here on this porch." "I believe it was on your porch, not this one," Quinton corrected gently. "But yes, I remember. I was terrified you would refuse me." "I was terrified you would not ask." Helena leaned against him. "I had been hoping for weeks that you would." "We wasted a lot of time being terrified when we could have been kissing," Quinton observed. "We made up for it later," Helena said with a smile. They sat together in the warm spring darkness, comfortable in the silence that only came from decades of shared life. Helena thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that desperate day when she found a bleeding stranger by her creek to this moment, surrounded by the family and legacy they had built together. "Quinton," she said softly. "Yes, my love." "If you could go back and change anything, would you?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I would have been more careful on that ride from Reno," he said finally. "Getting shot was unpleasant, and I put you through a lot of worry, but would I change anything that led me to you?" "Not a single thing. Not even nearly dying, not even that, because it brought me to you and you became my whole world." He took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles in the familiar gesture that still sent warmth through her. "Every pain, every challenge, every moment of difficulty was worth it because it led me here to you, to this life we have made together." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. "I feel the same way. Sometimes I think about that young woman I was, so alone and so afraid, barely holding on to her little piece of land. I would not want to go back to that, but I would not trade the journey either, because it brought me you." "We were both lonely," Quinton said quietly. "Both looking for something we did not know how to name. And then we found each other, and suddenly everything made sense." "Everything made sense," Helena agreed. They sat together until the night grew cold and Quinton's joints began to ache from the chill. They went inside to the bedroom they had shared for decades, helping each other prepare for bed with the ease of long practice. Helena brushed out her hair, now pure white, while Quinton changed into his nightshirt. They settled into bed together, and Helena curved into Quinton's side as she had done for nearly 40 years. "I love you," Quinton murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Helena whispered back. "Always and forever." They fell asleep together, hands clasped, hearts joined, while outside the stars wheeled overhead and the ranch settled into the quiet of night. The seasons turned, and Helena and Quinton continued their peaceful life at the Circle A. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, welcomed new great-great-grandchildren, and watched with pride as the younger generations took on more responsibility for the ranch operations. The empire Quinton had built continued to thrive under new management, proof that he had built something lasting. On a warm afternoon in June of 1923, just a few weeks before what would have been their 41st wedding anniversary, Helena found Quinton in his study, going through old papers. He looked up when she entered, and his face lit with the smile she loved. "Look what I found," he said, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. "The original contract we drew up for the improvements to your property. Do you remember? We sat at your table and worked out every detail." Helena came to look over his shoulder. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded, but she could still make out their younger selves in the careful words and precise terms. "I was so nervous about accepting help from you," she said. "I thought I had to do everything myself to prove I could survive." "You would have survived," Quinton said. "You are the strongest person I know, but I am glad you let me help. Glad you let me into your life." "Best decision I ever made," Helena said, kissing his temple. "Besides saying yes when you asked to court me." "That was the second best decision," Quinton agreed with a smile. "The first was dragging my unconscious body out of the creek and into your cabin." They spent the afternoon going through old papers and photographs, reliving memories and telling stories. There were pictures of their wedding, of their children as babies, of the ranch in its early days. Each image brought with it a flood of memories, and they talked and laughed until the sun began to set. That evening, they walked together through the ranch grounds, Quinton leaning heavily on his cane and Helena holding his arm for support. They visited the barns where Quinton had spent so many hours in the early days, the pastures where generations of cattle had grazed, the houses where their children and grandchildren now lived. "We built something good here," Quinton said as they stood on a small rise overlooking the main ranch complex. "Something that will last long after we are gone." "We did," Helena agreed. "Together." "Always together," Quinton said and kissed her softly in the fading light. They walked slowly back to the main house, comfortable in their silence and in each other's presence. That night they settled into bed as they always did, hands clasped and hearts joined. They talked quietly about nothing important, just the small, comfortable conversation of two people who had shared a lifetime together. "Helena," Quinton said softly as they were drifting off to sleep. "Yes, thank you for everything. For saving my life, for loving me, for building this life with me. You made me happier than I ever imagined I could be." Helena squeezed his hand. "You did the same for me. We were lucky, you and I. We found each other when we both needed it most, and we built something beautiful together." "We did," Quinton agreed. "We really did." They fell asleep together as they had done for more than 14,000 nights, secure in their love and in the life they had created. And when morning came, Helena woke to find Quinton still beside her, still holding her hand, his face peaceful in eternal sleep. She did not cry immediately. Instead, she sat beside him for a long time, holding the hand that had held hers for 40 years, looking at the face she had loved for even longer. She thought about the young man she had found by the creek, bleeding and unconscious. She thought about the moment he had first opened his eyes and looked at her. She thought about every kiss, every conversation, every ordinary moment that had made up their extraordinary life together. "Thank you," she whispered to him, even though he could not hear. "Thank you for every moment. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for the life we built. I will miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I would not trade a single moment of what we had together." She kissed his forehead gently, then rose to tell the family. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and condolences and grief. The funeral was held at the church in Verde, the same church where they had been married. It seemed that half of Nevada came to pay their respects, testament to the life Quinton had lived and the impact he had made. Helena stood at the graveside, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and listened as the preacher spoke about Quinton's life and legacy. But she was thinking about private things, about the man who had loved her with such devotion, who had made her laugh and challenged her to grow, who had been her partner in every sense of the word. As they lowered him into the ground, young William came to stand beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. He was 21 now, the same age Quinton had been when he came to Nevada with nothing but a dream. "He loved you so much, grandmother," William said softly. "Everyone knew it. He could never look at you without smiling." "I loved him too," Helena said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "More than I can ever express." In the weeks and months that followed, Helena adjusted to life without Quinton. It was harder than she had imagined after so many years of companionship. The house felt too quiet, the bed too large, the days too empty without him. But she was surrounded by family who loved her, and gradually she found her footing. She continued to work in her garden at the old property, finding peace in the familiar rhythm of planting and tending and harvesting. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, watching the younger generations take on the responsibility of running the Circle A. And she told stories about Quinton, keeping his memory alive for those who were too young to have known him well. On what would have been their 42nd wedding anniversary, Helena rode out to the meadow where Quinton had given her the locket and told her he loved her for the first time. She sat beneath the oak tree, older now but still standing strong, and opened the locket she wore around her neck. Quinton's photograph was there on one side, just as it had been for more than 40 years. On the other side was a photograph of their wedding day, the two of them young and smiling and full of hope. "I miss you," she said aloud as if he could hear her. "Every day, every moment I miss you, but I am grateful too, grateful for every year we had together, every memory we made. You gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was a lonely young woman struggling to survive on 20 acres of scrubland. You gave me love and partnership and a family that stretches across generations. You gave me everything." The breeze rustled through the oak leaves, and for a moment Helena could almost feel Quinton there beside her, his hand in hers, his love surrounding her. She sat for a long time in the meadow, remembering and grieving and celebrating the extraordinary life they had shared. Eventually, she rose and returned to the ranch, to the family and the legacy they had built together. She was 84 years old now, and she knew her own time was growing short. But she was not afraid. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return. When her time came, she would go peacefully, knowing that somewhere Quinton was waiting for her, ready to take her hand once more. The years passed. Helena grew frailer but remained sharp in mind and spirit. She continued to tend her garden, receive her family, and tell stories about the early days of the Circle and the man who had built it. She had become something of a legend herself, the woman who had saved Quinton Ashford's life and become his partner in building a ranching empire. On a warm spring morning in 1925, just a few weeks past her 86th birthday, Helena died peacefully in her sleep. Her family gathered to mourn and to celebrate a life well lived. She was buried beside Quinton under a stone that read, "Helena Pratt Ashford, beloved wife, mother, grandmother." She saved more than a life. She built a legacy. At the funeral, Thomas spoke about his mother with tears in his eyes. "My mother once told me," he said, "that the day she found my father by the creek was the day both their lives truly began." She dragged a bleeding stranger into her home and ended up with a love story that spanned more than 40 years. She taught us all that compassion and courage can change not just one life but generations to come. She saved my father, and in doing so, she gave life to all of us. The Circle, a ranch, continued to thrive under the management of Thomas and his children and grandchildren. The land that Helena had once struggled to maintain as a young widow became part of a legacy that stretched across Nevada and California. Her original cabin was preserved as a historical site, a reminder of the woman who had lived there and the stranger she had saved. And in the meadow where Quinton had first told Helena he loved her, beneath the ancient oak tree where they had shared so many moments, a bench was placed with a plaque that read, "For Helena and Quinton, whose love story began with an act of courage and grew into a legacy that will last forever." The wildflowers continued to bloom there every spring, and the spring continued to bubble peacefully, and the generations that came after would bring their children there to tell the story of the woman who nursed a stranger back to health and discovered he was not just the richest cowboy in the valley, but the love of her life and the father of a dynasty. Their love story became legend, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the extraordinary things that can happen when one person decides to help another in their moment of greatest need. Helena and Quinton had built something that lasted far beyond their own lives. A family, a legacy, and a love story for the ages.